Welcome to IndoctriNation, a weekly conversation series about protecting yourself from systems of control. I'm your host, Rachel Bernstein.
Hello, everyone. Today on the show, we have a returning guest, Anne Peterson. She devoted herself for 20 years to Landmark, the training and development company she believed was transforming lives. She even helped launch the public reemergence of the guru behind the organization, Werner Erhard. But ultimately, Anne faced a reckoning. The organization and Erhard were corroding the message that initially sparked her passion. After years of rationalizing away the red flags, the harm beneath the surface became undeniable to her. Anne now focuses on helping others navigate personal development without exploitation, drawing on her experiences to provide guidance on recognizing manipulation. Her new book, Is This a Cult? Confronting the Line Between Transformation and Exploitation, is an inspiring tale of rebuilding integrity in the shadow of charismatic leaders, and it offers hope to all who wonder whether their quest for growth has a dark side. If you haven't already, make sure to check out our previous episode with Anne, which is linked in the show notes. Learn more about Anne and her work at isthisoccultbook.com. And you can also find some information about Anne's recovery group facilitated by me in the show notes as well. Here is Anne now. It is my absolute pleasure to be able to have Anne Peterson with me today for this very special show. It's about a particular group, but it's really about more. It's about how you learn to think and how you learn to deflect and what goes on in the internal process of the mind after being involved in a group like this. And it's something I've talked a little bit about on the show, where I've mentioned that sometimes in the support group that I do, well, a couple of the support groups that I do, I've noticed a time delay, that there are times that people will want to share certain things, but it feels like I see their eyes moving, but their mouth isn't moving, like they're thinking and they're going through a whole list of questions and deflecting certain kind of thoughts that say, this isn't true, or is that important enough to bring up, or am I complaining, or am I whining? Just the whole checklist, so that there is this long period of silence where I feel like they're saying and speaking volumes, but in their mind, and having to jump through hurdles. And I picture like an obstacle course, like having to jump over this and go around that, and in order just to say what's true. And so I would love to be able to get into that with you today, but I would love also, more importantly, for you to take a moment to introduce yourself and all the wonderful things that you do, and also what brings you to care about this subject.
Yeah. Thank you, Rachel. You just described it really well, what we call cognitive dissonance, right? Like, how do we hold multiple truths at once? And then that's before we even get into what the heck is the truth anyway, and how do we tell, and la, 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 la. But anyway, so I'm here because at the age of 27, I figured it out the other day. I participated in my first personal development workshop at the Landmark Forum. And of course, like so many, the story is very simple. I was in a life crisis, and my best friend said, do this weekend program and you'll be able to, know what to do next. And you'll know whether you guys should stay married or divorced or whatever. You'll be able to make a choice. Her big thing was choice rather than a decision. So decision refers to a reflexive, reactionary kind of move versus choice, which is deliberative. And I just want to go on the record as saying that is not what is available out of Landmark Forum. But I did go ahead and I did end up doing the program and saying, oh yeah, we should split up and whatnot. And that did end up being the right choice for me. But I think I would have made that, the forum wasn't the tipping point for that. So Anyway, but so that starts at 27. And then I progressed all the way through the Landmark education. Then it became Landmark Worldwide and all the things, all the way through the leader groups, and became a senior program leader and staff member for a particular division inside of that organization. Who I worked with were the senior graduates of that particular ideology and that group. And so I progressed all the way, kind of, you could say, through all the rings to the inner circle. And by the time I left in 2012, I had a very good reputation and a lot of training. And I was kind of a bit of a unicorn because I knew how to fill programs, run, hundreds of people on a volunteer team, manage all the production, and facilitate, and deliver. So I could do all the things. I was like an independent station, if you will. And so I got invited to host a program for the source or the founder of the Landmark World, a gentleman by the name of Werner Erhard. And he was working with another high-level academic, Mike Jensen, as well as Steve Zaffron, who was the head of the Landmark business development, but I now know has been a part of Landmark almost, not quite since its inception, but pretty close. And then it's a couple of other colleagues they were committed to developing a program that was supposed to be a whole new approach to leadership, the ontological, phenomenological approach. What does that mean? That means looking at leadership from the lens of who you're being, distinct from having just the tools and for doing leadership. That's what they would say, is it was about being a leader, not doing leadership. And they wanted to develop this course and introduce it into academia, which I would come to understand was more about, for the Werner Landmark side, it was about legitimizing their approach to education, their approach, their methodology, and really legitimizing it. And that's now a thing that I've also come to learn is very common in these groups. These leaders want the stamp of approval of academia. Like that is the golden ring. And they've all got some version of it. And Landmark is still in the pursuit of that. They are partnering with Fullerton, the business school in Fullerton, California, part of the California university system. And they have bought their way into setting up what's going to be the Landmark Leadership Center. And it's going to have a Werner Erhard. You can't call it a library because it's against the university rules, but that's essentially what it is, like a presidential library of all of his works and da-da-da-da-da. And that's this big stamp of approval by the university system. And that was really the background agenda. I would come to understand that much later, but that was that project. But the long and the short of it is I ended up from 2012 through 2019 hosting this group of thought leaders to develop this material, deliver it to public audiences. We raised a lot of money for an educational foundation that was supposedly there to support this effort, to help fund the research and development around the ideas and fund training university professors and lecturers that wanted to deliver it in their universities. There was this whole mission, right? And the mission ultimately was about getting the ontological, phenomenological approach, also known as transformation in the Landmark circles, introduced into the university or higher education system worldwide. So that was all about that. And then I would come to find out, so now I'm working with the source, I'm kind of deep inside it, I would start to find out that a lot of the things that I had understood about Landmark were kind of true, but maybe not so much. The main thing being that Werner Erhard had left it in 1990 and didn't really have much to do with the organization other than an occasional consulting or helping them out. I would come to find out that he's much, much, much more deeply involved, mostly since my book came out. And then because I would also find out that Werner was very abusive to his staff, not just verbally abusive, which I had seen, but physically abusive, that his employment practices are tantamount to domestic slavery and a little human trafficking mixed in. Well, keep in mind what's happening now. It's 2019, 2020. The Vow has come out. Every week a new documentary is coming out about a group or organization exploiting, abusing its power, its people. And I'm watching these and I'm going, wait, but we did that. Wait, but that's familiar. So that created a kind of existential crisis, particularly when I found out about the physical assault. That was like a line too far for me. And so I started to question everything. And then that's in 2020. And then I ultimately, what are we in 2024? So March of this year, I wrote a book. Actually, it was this exact time last year that I wrote it. I released it in March, called Is This a Cult? Confronting the Line Between Transformation and Exploitation. And my aim was to put in the public domain the kinds of questions I had been grappling with in the ensuing the couple years before, as new information started to come on board. And I was put in the position of questioning everything that I had stood for, participated in, been a leader of, raised a lot of money for, all these things. And my book, Is This a Cult? Question mark, I think is a question that, whether you use the C word or not, the cult world, that's got all kinds of heat to it. But that really was authentically my question. Wait, what have I really been involved with? Was I really transforming the world? Was I really making a positive difference? What are the dangers that I didn't maybe know about or see? So I just started questioning everything. And that's where I still am today. I'm deeply questioning pretty much everything related to the human potential movement. And along the way, I met the folks at Seek Safely, seeksafely.org. And that was a real lifeline for me, because when I met them, when I met Ginny Brown, the founder and whatnot, I was like, oh, there are people out there that understand the value and the good side of personal development and wellness and things like that, but are out to make it better. Before then, I was like, oh my gosh, I have to now, at my mid-50s, like throw away my whole professional life because it's so corrupt. It's so yucky. It's so, as I was learning, I was just like, how can I do this? Like, I can't be involved in this industry. And yet it's the only thing I've known since I was 27 years old. So I was really stuck in a lot of ways. So when I met them and found that there were people who were talking about how can we really make it better, solutions, that was a big lifeline for me. So I literally went up to one of their events, introduced myself and said, okay, I'm here to collaborate. I have all these talents and I want to put them to work here, and that's kind of part of my own healing, actually, is doing that. So anyway, that's the Cliff Notes. For the long story, read the book.
Right. Yes. I like that the book is right behind you, over your left shoulder. Yes, it's wonderful. And what's interesting too, a couple things with the support group that you've put together that you've asked me to facilitate, which has been quite an honor. It has been really interesting to see how much people have been injured. And also part of the injury is a moral injury. Knowing that you were leading something and passing something on. And I want to come back to this idea of moral injury. But first, I do want to mention that it's very interesting when you talk about this human potential movement. I think at its core, people were supposed to be kind of learning how to be authentically them. And then when you think about Werner Erhard, that it's not his real name, and right, that he's crafted a persona, and he had all these nicknames, and then he changed his name completely. And the name of the organization has changed multiple times. People will know it from the 70s as EST, and then the Forum, and then the Forum Weekend, and then Landmark and Landmark Education. But it's all basically the same with some permutations here and there, but over time.
I'll tell you, I've studied it deeply now, because I came in 1995, so I only knew kind of rumors about the front. It's the same. It's the same.
Right.
It's the same.
It is incredible. Right. I mean, the Forum Weekend was touted as something a little lighter, but ultimately the after effects were the same. People would come into my office and they'd say, oh, I went to a Forum Weekend, and I didn't know at that time that EST had changed to be called the Forum, or that there was this Forum Weekend. But as people were talking, I was thinking, wait, I've heard all of this before, but under a different name, right? It had different packaging. So here you have a leader who has changed his name. The name of the group keeps changing. It's told that he's not involved anymore, but he really is involved. There's so much that's slippery. But here, everyone else is supposed to be authentically them and true to themselves. Really? I mean, how is that even possible in such a slippery place?
What they tout is that they, you come out of their courses. So again, going back to ontological, phenomenological, you don't come out knowing about integrity, knowing about responsibility, knowing about authenticity. Those are core ideas. You come out being more integrous, being more responsible, being more authentic. That's at the very heart of what they profess differentiates them. And there's a level of truth to that. And just what I would say, as I've been fully in and a leader and delved deeply, deeply, spent hundreds of thousands of hours in their technology working it, is kind of true. But what makes it true where it is that you come out with, a higher level of integrity, a higher level of responsibility, high level. It's not the work and the processes that does that. It's you. And that's really the main message in my book that I try to come back around to, is like, no, no, no. The source, there's a big conversation in that community about who the source is. And they'll tell you the source is Werner. And then when they had to hide Werner, the source became the organization or the distinctions. But never has the source been you, the participant. It could be a little bit you, the graduate, but what makes you special as a graduate is that you have mastered these ideas, this work. You have become the distinctions. You've become that. So it's very slippery and it's very confusing because there is enough truth in it. Like you could say, when I did the forum and I decided to go ahead and leave my husband, who was being abusive to my son, his stepson, and not a healthy, well person, and, spending all of our money on drugs and like all this stuff. So did it have more integrity in my life to say, okay, yeah, no, you should leave? Of course it did. But did the forum make that difference? It only can make the difference that I made, right? So that's, to me, that's a big part of my message, is whether you participate in any of these groups or read that book or listen to that tape or watch that show or whatever, where the insight is happening, where the breakthrough is happening, where the being more responsible, that's happening with you. And I've been around long enough to know that would have happened with you, probably regardless of whether you participated in that thing or this other thing or this other thing. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Oh,
that's the part.
absolutely.
That's the part that I
Absolutely.
think so confusing. And I want to say
Yeah.
something
Sure,
just to
sure.
that you said when you said the pain, because my book published on March 7th of this year. I'll never forget it. On March 8th at 4 p.m., I hit my first thing on Facebook, which I knew then all the Landmark people were going to find out like that. And it was all very deliberate. And it was the scariest thing ever. I am the first person and the only deep insider to be willing to speak up publicly about what it's really like in that organization, in that group, in that community, and including the good stuff. There's a lot of really good stuff, right? And that's why I said I was going to speak up, because I knew I would speak to the whole of it, not just the problems, but the good things too. But the thing that's happened since my book came out is I have heard from hundreds now of, particularly program leaders and staff is where the most injury is, and heard story after story after story after story of real emotional, spiritual, physical, mental damage, long-term damage from their participation. And nobody has been more shocked by that than me. Nobody. And it's been challenging. And thank goodness I had met Ginny at Sake Safely, who also happens to be a therapist. And then I got Sarah and Nippy of A Little Bit Culty, had met them a little bit before my book came out. So they have been just incredibly supportive as I've gone through the spaces since the book came out, of really waking up to the dark side that was so much darker than I understood until I started hearing from all these people. And so many people calling me and saying, thank you, thank you, thank you for speaking up. Like, thank you for saying out loud the stuff that we've all kind of known, but we've been putting away because we were afraid that if we talked about the bad stuff, we would kill the good stuff. That's the fundamental reason why people don't speak up. And there's 5 of us that are talking publicly about Landmark. 5 out of millions.
Incredible. Incredible. Really. I mean, it is also really an incredible thing because that happens so often where I know people who have been abused in every way and go to their pastor or go to whomever and are told, Shh, keep it quiet because we raise money for the poor and you're going to destroy everything.
You're going to destroy what's good if you talk about what's
What's
bad.
good and what we
Yeah.
provide and, you're going to take away people's faith and their hope and the path they're on and they've worked so hard to get there and somehow you're going to be sabotaging it for everyone. I've often said that if the leaders of groups often, if they can step out of the way, then you have an organization that's usually populated by people who care and who want to make their life better, want to make the world a better place, actually have a sense of responsibility, have a sense of integrity. And so if the person pulling the strings can keep everyone else from becoming sort of their marionette and just cut the strings, let them be, then you'd have people who really want to do, by and large, want to do good things and hold themselves up to a certain standard. Just like you're saying, you might have done these great things on your own and made decisions for yourself on your own. And I think that that's actually really true. I think a lot of people also have more integrity and sense of responsibility than they realize, especially after being involved in a group like this, where I think you're made to feel like the only reason you have that is because of the group. And so you're now feeling dependent on your adherence to the group and following what people say in order to live a good and responsible life. But that's actually rarely the case. Left to your own devices, you'd actually probably do okay and maybe even better if not for this group. It's also interesting to hear about how many connections there are to Scientology, which I'm sure you have uncovered in spades. So I'm wondering if you can let people know about that because they've heard about Scientology a lot and continue. And, I have people on very often talking about their experiences in Scientology and using some of the lingo. And I knew about some of the connections, but now talking to you and talking to other people in the support group, hearing the terminology that it's so flagrantly the same.
Somewhere along the way, I was told that Landmark is sort of known, particularly in the Scientology realm, as Scientology Light, and there is all these comparisons, right? So Sarah and I have had fun too talking about the comparison between NXIVM and Landmark, because in her world, there's a Landmark Center in Vancouver, and then she was responsible for and opened the NXIVM Center. And, NXIVM was the steak dinner, Landmark was the McDonald's, which Landmark would have happily, a Landmark person, if I put on my Landmark leader cap, I would have said, well, yeah, I'd rather be the McDonald's because more people are eating quarter pounders than are eating that expensive steak. So, ha, 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 we're better than you, right? But no, as I've come to know it through many people, so a lot of people out of my book have now reached out to me and shared with me a lot of the history that I didn't know. I only knew the history that was sort of fed to me. Landmark's marketing department is actually their Department of Defense. So Landmark's marketing department has been very, very, very much dedicated to keeping the airwaves as clean as possible about Landmark. This is the other reason people don't speak up. They have a reputation of being extremely litigious. Now, one of the things that's important to know is they threaten legal action a lot more than they do it, but that doesn't mean they won't do it, right? So they did sue Rick Ross and so on. Margaret Singer, in those days. So they've worked very, very, very hard to separate themselves from the riffraff, as it were, of the, we now kind of bucket the human potential world, but really starts with Scientology and mind dynamics and its partner leadership dynamics, which is kind of the business version of mind dynamics by William Patrick Penn, I think is the name of the guy that started that. So there's Werner in his young years, and he's an MLM guy. He's, selling encyclopedias, children's books like that. He eventually also sells vitamins, gets in that's why there's like all this intermingling. You hear me talk about personal development and wellness a lot together because there's a lot of back and forth in those two spaces. And he wants to be more effective. He's a very ambitious guy. He's very ambitious. He's very smart. Rick Ross says he's one of the shrewdest he's ever encountered. I would agree with that completely. And I worked closely with him for 9 years. And he wants to, it's all about performance. But think about the 70s, 80s, 90s. Everything was started to be about performance, right? It's all about production and performance, what you can do. There's a period where we thought with neuroplasticity, when we start, getting better and better brain scans, like the brain has unlimited potential to wire itself and all this stuff. So they're in the midst of all that. And, Werner in his early times in the 60s is using Scientology. It's my understanding that he was an auditor, which is kind of like the beginning levels of Scientology leadership. He went to the kind of the base level of auditing, and theirs was up until fairly recently, like within the last 10 years. I've had people tell me like, oh yeah, there was an e-meter, the thing with the cans, at world headquarters in Landmark, and Chris Shelton told me recently that he's a Scientology, he's become a good friend. And he was talking about, people have told him, yeah, there were dictionaries. The Scientology dictionaries were on the back tables of the early S trainings. They did not, early on, they didn't hide the relationship, their, appreciation for Scientology. They didn't start hiding that until Scientology's relationship or a reputation starts to go to shit, like then they're like, oh, well, we don't know them. We're not them.
Right, exactly.
And
Yeah.
L. Ron Hubbard was very, very angry and, declares Werner fair game, which basically says to any Scientology person, you can do anything to him you want, shut him down. He's taking our work, he's stealing. So, Werner, being shrewd, starts to rename things and whatnot. But Werner, like many thought leaders or gurus in this industry, does kind of what they all do, which is they go do each other's courses and programs and read books and this and that. And then they basically reword everything to be theirs. So it's very common. I mean, I talk a little bit in my book about somebody, I don't name him publicly, but Yoga Man, who's a big yoga guru, and he hired me for a number of years. And he hired me in part because I went to one of his courses and I said, you can't do that. You're using Landmark ideas. They're going to sue you into tomorrow. You can't do that. Plus, you don't really understand what you're talking about anyway, because I could tell he didn't kind of like really get it. So he ended up hiring me to redesign and create, the portion of his trainings that, not the yoga part, but the mindfulness part, the inquiry, he called it, because am very, very, very versed in all those ideas. And even then, and it was fun for me because I wasn't going to break my integrity and use Landmark's work. So I had to study. So I had to really start to study and learn. And then I had to really learn about yoga and see how we could create a more cogent and cohesive mindfulness aspect that really went with yoga and was not stealing other people's work. And then he'd go off and do a Newfield seminar and he'd come back, oh, I want to put this in. And I'm like, did Newfield give you permission to put that in? We're not putting that in unless Newfield gave you permission to put that in. And so there's a lot of, the industry makes some of its own problems with all that. And that's not uncommon there's pharmaceutical industry, same thing. We can all take the healing property of XYZ plant, but now we got to make up another formula that nobody else has so that we can patent it, so that we can sell it as our own. And, that whole system is actually breaking down because it doesn't work actually in an endless fashion. Yeah, so Scientology is definitely all over it. And then I could barely look because I was always so proud that I did not get sucked into Scientology. I literally just 2 months ago watched the whole Going Clear movie. I had watched like part of it in like 2016 and had to turn it off because it was freaking me out because the language was so the same. And then also getting to know Chris and he and I have had many hours of conversation and he says stuff and I'm like, what? No, that's this. So now we actually have straight up conversations. I like text him. I'm like, okay, what is this in Scientology? And it's directly corollary. And then as Werner grew in popularity and fame and he would get to know other people, then he would take little bits of these other things as well. Like he'd get enamored with an idea and then he'd come back just like Yoga Man and he'd integrate it into the next training. So maybe there's a little Zen Buddhism that shows up because he spent, 2 months in India with, Muktananda. And so now you've got some Buddhism in there and now you've got like all that. That's the way it works. But it's Scientology and Landmark's distinctions and work are very, very much parallel in track.
It's interesting because this is why I think it's so important to learn history just in general. right? You want to learn the history of a lot of things so you know where ideas came from, so you know what to link it back to. I don't know if by the time this airs, another one of my conversations with John Atack in England is going to be coming out. But we chat every once in a while, and he lets me know what he's working on and what he's studying, and he has a lot to talk about the whole conspiratorial movement and flat earthers and the government now, et cetera, here in the US, and some of the terminology that's used that harkens back to Nazi era propaganda, like the same terminology. And so to know where those words originated and what the original intention was for them is a really important thing, because it says a lot about the leaders now and what they value and what they respect and what they hope to be like and what they hope to achieve. And it's very interesting to know all of that and to get a sense of that history. It's disturbing as hell. And that's probably why, just watching Going Clear, any major and good documentary about Scientology is going to be disturbing. Chris Shelton has been on the show a bunch, and he's someone who also he and I talked a while back about something that I want to bring up with you about this idea of sort of gaslighting yourself. There is this idea too, and I'm looking over while we're talking because I have the Scientology dictionary here. I've turned it around so that when people see my bookshelf, they're not worried that I'm a Scientologist, but I know it's there and it's very thick, but it's English and not English. It's like, it sort of seems like the word, but it means something else, which is part of, I think, the dissociative piece of some of these groups where you learn words, but they're used slightly differently. And I've learned to ask people to define the words that they're using so I understand what they mean by it. And being fair gamed, I also want to talk about, because it's something that's happened to me a bunch of times. In fact, more recently in the last couple of years, there was another complaint that Scientology made to my board against me, which have always been started by Scientology. And it's when something happens where I'm working with someone who is was a major player there, and they're sure that I'm now an enemy, and so I get fair gamed. And they actually let on that they were up to it in a way that they were not expecting. I got a call from the editor of their ironically titled Freedom Magazine online. And he said, "We want to get a statement from you about the complaint against you that was made to your board." And I said, "What complaint?" Because they knew about it before I knew about it, which means they were behind it. So, because the person who has the complaint against them is notified, and then other people, then it becomes a public record, or people can find out, and Scientology scours the internet to see who's been complained against. But the fact that they knew about it before I did, I actually contacted my board and they said, "We have to follow up because they did this in an official way." But clearly the timing shows who was behind it. And when I said to the person at Freedom Magazine, "What complaint?" he quickly hung up because he realized he had blown it in terms of the timing. But anyway, I think just knowing that there are these enemies of the group, it goes to the heart of this idea of responsibility and integrity and being true to yourself. I'm wondering, even though you've gotten wonderful responses to your book, I'm sure that there have been really hard moments too, and responses you've gotten where you're seen as the enemy, which I think says a lot about the health of an organization and how it's run and how militant people get and how they can't stand and they can't tolerate, or they're told not to tolerate anyone kind of bringing things to light. So just for you to be able to talk a little bit about what it's been like for you and the responses you've gotten that have been difficult.
Well, I have a troller now, who trolls my YouTube channel. So I started a little YouTube show, Confronting the Line, so I could, just talk more in depth about the different questions that I raise in my book and then the things that I've learned since. So I have this troller that goes on there and says all kinds of really nasty, calls me names and violates he gets removed once in a while. They think I remove him. No, I don't remove YouTube removes him because they're violating the community rules. So whoever this person is. But then they just create another identity and they go on there. And when that first started happening, that was the first like in my face where I had somebody really like in both a public domain, but directly at me that I have this agenda. I'm just trying to steal Landmark's customers. Just trying to make money. I like all of this stuff that, trust me, I wish some of it were kind of truer than it is. I'm still, for anybody who wants to know, I'm still losing more money than I'm making on anything because part of the things you deal with when you come out of a group like this is you're scared. You don't want to be like that. So you kind of like paralyze yourself a little bit, right? A good friend of mine right now is like, Anne, because I really do, I need to get a job or, start earning some money. And she's like, Anne, you need to put yourself out there as a coach, like you have, and I've always had 4 or 5 or so people that I coach, would provide kind of coaching services for. And I'm like, I don't know if I can do that. I've always done it as a gift. I've never allowed people, the one person I let pay me. I've always done it as a gift because I like that energy. So hearing things like that, like that's the one that probably gets under my skin the most because the truth is so the opposite. It's so the other side, right? And no, I've been professionally destroyed long before my book came out. It's chapter 8 in my book when Landmark threatened me that if I tried to do any events or programs under this whole company I had set up to run this leadership course, and they're like, well, if you do anything and you have Landmark customers, we're going to sue you. So it's part of why I decided to speak up. I was already in jail doing the time. That's how I put it. So I'm like, well, I might as well do the crime. And which speaking up in that community is a crime, saying anything that could damage the reputation of Werner Erhard or the organization. At first, that was difficult, like just kind of seeing that, like I felt hurt, I felt defensive, I felt all those things. And then, thank God I have great friends. I actually called Chris and, I'm like, okay, what do you guys do, with this, and got some great advice. And basically the advice is don't do anything. Just don't interact with it. Don't feed the monster. As I have a great coach who refers to that all the time. She's like, just don't feed the monster. Don't interact with it. So I don't. But it still hurts from time to time. The harder part, honestly, Rachel, has been, I'm still super connected in that community. For 25 years, everybody in my life is a Landmark leader or, there's different people in the community that are going through really challenging things. But I won't comment on any of their stuff because I know that being connected to me could be hurtful to them in that community, for example. So I have a lot of friends behind the scenes that I can't be friends with publicly, if that makes sense. So that's a little challenging. But the harder part is feeling cut off, feeling like recognizing in those moments, in those quiet moments when I realize I no longer am in the who's who of a who's who community, right? That's the egoic part. But the heart part is where you're like, well, I can be friends with this person in secret, but I can't be friends with them in public. That is tough. Like, that's where it kind of hurts, right? You're just like, oh, and I do think from time to time, I'm like, what was I thinking? What was I thinking? I should have just kept my mouth closed and tried to just, gone off and I don't know, just done something totally else or whatnot. And I know that's not right, but it wouldn't have been right for me because honestly, it would have been violating the very thing I taught for 20 some years, which is being true to yourself, being true to your values, being authentic to who you say you are. Like, and a lot of Landmark graduates recognize that if they have the courage to read the book. See, many don't read the book because they don't want to wrestle with the question, is it a cult? They've also been told, I have been told, the organization is basically, well, why would you want to, Anne's just a, disgruntled employee and just, she's, and then they use the stuff, I'm just being a racket or I'm just on it or one drives me the most crazy is I'm incomplete with the organization. I'm not incomplete, you idiots. I am not fucking incomplete. I am so complete because I have been true to myself, which is exactly what I learned there. So shut up with that nonsense. Like, that's ridiculous. I would have been incomplete if I witnessed and knew about abuse and, these unlawful practices and all being done in the name of transformation. And I did nothing. That's the problem, is I couldn't not say because that was what was incomplete. Stepping forward and actually being true to myself, being true to my values, being true to the work that I spent 20 years teaching. This is what it looks like to be complete, people. This is what it looks like. And I've had one senior Landmark leader contact me who read the book right off the first weekend it came out. And he contacted me and he acknowledged that. He said, it's very clear to me, and he's one of the originals. It's very clear to me that you live and breathe the distinctions we teach. Like it's in there. Your book is actually a demonstration of that. And I was like, wow, thank you. I appreciate that. And I mean, I knew that, but it was great to hear somebody else say that. So the only people who really have a problem with me are the people who don't read the book because they've been told not to, or they've been told that it's, gossip or whatever the things that organizations like this use to suppress truth, all those things, right? It's I'm a racket, all that. It's the weaponization of the very ideas that create authenticity, power, and integrity. When you weaponize those ideas, you get the opposite. Yeah, so it's challenging from time to time.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure. But I love that you got that affirmation from someone who really knows from the inside that you were enacting the things you were taught and that it was guiding you to want to do what was right, and knowing that it wasn't going to be a popular thing to put out there for people who were going to be upset by it and who were not, as I see, either people who are still so connected to the group or they're just emotionally not ready. They're not ready to see. They're kind of maybe on the cusp and they're not ready to really look at it.
It's scary. You don't want to find out that you were tricked, that you were wrong, or that the thing that has been giving you what feels like power and solace might actually be wrong. Like not be that, right? Like yesterday it was actually for the landing page for the group that, I host, that you facilitate, right? For people who are looking to understand all this stuff. And one of the questions that came up as we were coming up with a list of questions people deal with was, how do I deal with the negativity in the world? Because in these systems is a whole logic system to deal with the pain, the strife, the confusion that the living of life and that the world around us are tossing, whether it's a religious system or a personal development system like this. But the path, the answers, the formula for how to relate to that is in that work. So you think if you question that work, you're going to lose that peace of mind. You're going to lose those tools. But I'm telling you, the exact opposite is true. If you really step out and you start to question and educate yourselves. So if you don't actually lose it. Some of them you'll lose. Like there's tools I don't use anymore. I actually want to do a series of shows on this. I'm trying to talk Chris into doing it with me, but where we take on some of the cliches, like context is decisive and, da-da-da-da-da. Like that, yes. If I come to understand context truly, then I say, well, context is decisive, sorta. Because there's a grain of truth in there. You mentioned earlier, you were talking about how so much of this work is embedded, and John is doing great work. I listen to his show regularly, but kind of tracing it back to white supremacy, Nazi, these ideas, right? That era, that 1930s, 1940s, like that era. And it's not just that you end up adoring those people. That, to me, is just the surface of that problem. When we take those ideas and we start to use them and propagate them, we get those results, even if we think we're leaving the bad stuff out. Because as we say in Landmark, language creates the world. Does it really? No, it does not create the natural world, but it creates how I understand the world, how I interact with the world, how I see the world. So if I'm taking ideas that were put into the world, like if I'm taking the good parts, that's what they try to do. They try to go back to these teachers. Okay, great. He was a Nazi. I got it. But he did say some things that were really true. People say this about Werner. I still use different things Werner said to me. But I've now done the work to go find out about the whole world around those ideas. So now I understand, like, okay, context is sort of, yes, there is a meaning or an interpretation that I'm giving to the world, and that is the lens through which I operate. But it's very important to understand that's still not the world. My context is not going to change the circumstances. But most people who traffic in this, that one is in all the different Scientology, Landmark, they all have a version of it, right? What it has done, in my view, the more I study and learn, is it's created a lot of magical thinking, and it's created a permission structure that allows us to not live in reality. That to live in a reality called the world is what I make it. It's what I say it is. And that is now all over our society in ways that we are going to come to regret. We already are, right? Is that, and it's firmly embedded in all these all these organizations, all these teachings, Scientology, Landmark, Insight, Context, and then all their little babies that have spun off, all the International Coaching Federation, all this. That era has spun off a whole way of thinking and a whole philosophy about how human beings interact in the world. And it's got problems. It's got
Yeah.
big
Oh,
problems.
yes, right? Yes, it does. It absolutely does. And I think about people also who were raised in that or who are of that kind of thinking. Recently, there was a chance for me to drive somewhere, but I would be driving through the desert, and it was during the summer, and it was a heat wave. And I just remember saying to people, I just hope that I don't overheat or get a flat tire. And there are some people who said, yeah, I know, it's maybe you want to fly, maybe you don't want to drive. And others who would immediately respond by saying, don't say that. Don't say that because then you're going to create it. And then it leaps into the idea of false correlation. Like, then if that does happen, it's because I said it.
Yeah, so now you are literally where that ends up is in a guilt and shame cycle. It ends up in a kind of like, oh my gosh, and it's probably one of the biggest things that I deal with as residue, because I'm now, dealing with the residue of what I've internalized from spending 25 years inside of this very particular mindset. But, everything that goes wrong, I'm like, oh my God, there I did it again. And in a group like Landmark, which is particularly shrewd and tricky, because Landmark kind of says both things all the time. You create the circumstances, but the circumstances are only a function of the actions you take or don't take.
Right. That's totally two sides of the same coin. That's very confusing.
Exactly. It's
Wow.
very confusing. So, if I heard it, and I do road trips, I love you brought that one up. So to me now, it's like, no, yeah, I'm going to create, this is going to be a trip. In fact, funny story, when my husband and I first started doing road trips in the pandemic, which we did a whole bunch of because we live in the Dallas area and we're building up in the Seattle area. So we did all these road trips. And I said to my husband the first time, I said, okay, if you treat this road trip like a mission that we got to get through every day, I will leave you on the side of the road. I swear to God. Because there was,
Yeah.
so much stress. We were shutting down our business. All this stuff we were being threatened by Yoga Man and Landmark, and they
Oh,
were threatening
no.
people for doing business. I mean, it was crazy. It was so upsetting. And I said, we are going to go. We're going to have a rough direction in mind. We're going to have, and this journey is going to just be about us just breathing and hanging out together. Now, that's a context, right? That's something I have control over. And you know what? We put in the back of the car a whole safety kit and extra water and, little things we didn't have a bathroom and we had a little cooler and we had a little, so if I know I'm going to drive and it's going to be super hot, then I want to make sure I have the safety equipment and the things that I need. That's the action part. But their own teachings really leave a lot of people so disconnected from reality, so in this kind of magical thinking world that they don't have access. They don't take those kind of actions. And then if you put things in there like they don't have the resources, so somebody scrapes together the money, does something like the Landmark Forum gets, okay, you create your world. You are the source of you can create anything, da 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 da, but you're still living in a world. You're a young Black man living in an inner city.
Yeah. Right. Right. Yes.
Okay, but there's a whole bunch more to that story
Yeah.
that
Right.
you
Inherent
can't.
dangers.
Yeah,
Mhm.
you can't simply possibility your way out of that. I was talking to a guy recently who was actually in our group, and he happens to be a Black man, and he lives in a semi-southern city anyway. And we were kind of talking about this, and I said, well, you have a different relationship to the police than I do. He goes, no, I don't think I do. And I said, why? And he goes, well, I don't. He goes, I just never really had any of that. I've always, it's been great. And I don't, I said an interaction had happened with somebody else recently where she was witnessing something. And I said, oh, get the police. And it happened to be a Black woman. And she goes, why would I do that? And I realized in that moment that for me, a white woman, the police are safety. They are help. They are like that. And in her world, in her culture, that's not the way they're seen, right? So we had a laugh about it. So I'm talking to this other guy. He goes, no. I don't have any of that. I don't have any fear. I don't, I'm not afraid when I see the lights behind me and da-da-da. And I said, well, really? I said, oh, that's interesting. And he happened to say, he goes, yeah. He goes, I have my insurance card in a Bible in my glove box. And I just started laughing. I was like, okay, I would never think, but he lives in a southern city, right? So if he's going to be interacting with a cop with his registration, I don't know about you, Rachel, but my registration for my vehicle is not in a Bible.
It is not. No.
My glove box, right?
No.
But my point about that being is reality is a tricky thing, and it requires maturity. It requires work, and it's a huge opportunity as we continually true ourselves up to this is what I think and this is the reality. To me, that's where life is lived, is in that gap. So if I'm in this training where it's just like, well, I create the reality, how is that not a recipe for narcissism and egomania and all of these things that we see that ultimately end up in a pretty miserable life? I love what Dan Shaw said on your recent episode about traumatizing narcissists. They pretty much end up in an insane asylum or going crazy or for the most part, dementia.
Right. They kind of implode.
Yeah, they sort of
Yeah.
implode like when, and or we end up with these bipolar disorders. Not that that causes that necessarily, but I think there's some correlations there. When I'm unwilling to question my reality, I'm on a dangerous path.
Right. Exactly right. It's so interesting. My goodness. I mean, I'm thinking, yes. So going back to this idea of the police, yes, they represent safety. I don't trust all police officers, right? I mean, because I just trust all people. But I do think that I have felt that way. Now, my son, who's a social worker, works with the homeless, where he then will take them to go get new front teeth because they were knocked out by the police. Like some of them are so traumatized by the police, and trans kids and a lot of people who are just really, traumatized. Yeah, so that's their reality, and that's you add to your reality, I think, right? With new information, you need to kind of be open to it. I'm wondering also, just as we're finishing up, I could talk to you for days, so it's gonna feel really short. But when I was speaking at this conference that you had asked me to speak at, the Seek Safely Summit, you said something after I spoke that has stayed with me. And I said, let's talk about this and let's record a conversation about this because it was such a great insight. Because here, I'm often asked questions about how you define a cult and methods of control and manipulation. And I didn't have a sense of how much emotional and verbal deflection was going on with people listening who had been trained to not take in certain information, especially if it seemed critical or negative or pigeonholing or defining as a cult what they were involved in. And so when you said, yeah, all your definitions of what makes something a cult, I had an explanation for all of it. I had a reason to negate all of it. And, it's just kind of automatic. So I would love for people listening to have a sense of what that sounds like and what that's like back and forth. So when I was defining a cult, and I don't know if there's certain definitions that you remember me saying that really, like you had a really quick and automatic deflection for, but I'll just do
Just throw some out and let's see what comes up. Yeah, because
Okay.
I don't remember exactly. I just remember the duality
Yeah.
as you were talking. In my brain was just like, whoa. And how much my deflections were still there. Just quick. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So one of the definitions of a cult, I'm just choosing them randomly, is that you cannot question the leader or the teachings.
Yeah, well, so if you were in my guest room, I would say, oh, that's not true here at Landmark. We welcome questions. In fact, our technology is inviting you to question. in the guest room, that's what I would say. Now, if you were in a program, then when you get to a program and you bring up a question, it's going to get turned on you. Well, who are you being that that's the question that you would have? Is there something in your past that would have you be wondering about that? It would be turned around on you in some way. Maybe I'm going to use some shorthand terms, but is that a racket, which is a persistent complaint with a fixed way of being that has a whole bunch of costs and payoffs? So that you're questioning that. And you're also asked at the beginning of a program to suspend kind of everything almost, to suspend your already view of things and to be open to considering the perspective that the teacher is offering. And then you're invited at the end of the program, you can pick back up your concerns and your thoughts and your beliefs. But for the period of this program, we want you to suspend like how you see the various things that we're going to talk about. Like even integrity, for example. So they're going to define, there's a very particular definition of integrity. I actually really like it. I'm still kind of a fan of it. But we're going to ask you to suspend how you typically relate to integrity or how you typically relate to responsibility. And then we're going to show you another way that you could potentially that you could relate to that. And then at the end, you're welcome to step back into your view. But while you're here, we want you to be in our view. So see how I'm deflecting away your questioning, or I'm flipping your questioning back on you.
On me. Oh, that's so fascinating. Okay. So another definition is that the rules apply to the followers, not to the leaders. The leaders can do or say whatever they want.
So if you talk to anybody who's been in a leadership program inside of Landmark, that's not true. They are made to, at a certain point, to conform. Like they need to change their life to be a, quote, living representation of the work, right? So there's this interesting sort of conformity. Everybody sort of needs to look and act and speak the same way. So if you have practices, say you live an open lifestyle sexually, for example, that's one of the ones. We've had seminar leader candidates are told, well, you can't do that, or you can do that, but only in secret. But then you can't really do it because it's in your way in a guest room, da, 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 da. So there's a lot of contradiction in sort of that whole thing. Most of the leaders I still believe actually, my book is kind of an expression of it. I am living the work. But when there comes an opportunity to question the work itself, to push back on the practices because, hey, that doesn't have integrity, you are pretty much killed off. You're either taken out, kicked out, pushed out, taken out, or, completed out or whatever. You're going to be taken out in one form or another if you question and you do not conform to the pretense. So this is again landmark language, the pretense of what a landmark leader looks like. So there was a person in our group who was sharing about years and years and years of doing the introductory leadership training program and spent years living inside of a future that who I am as a forum leader and never could get to the most basic level. Now, she also happened to share she's neurodivergent. She's an older lady. She's not slim, trim, and blonde, like whatnot. And I knew as she was talking, I'm like, oh yeah, she never would have been candidated. But no leader would tell you that's why. They would have some whole other, oh, well, she's not confident in herself. Oh, well, she doesn't bring enough guests. Oh, well, she needs this other thing or whatnot. But there is a standard, and the standard is basically, I now understand the standard is very much Werner Erhard, or the perception of Werner, actually. I know Werner. I've gotten to know Werner. I think even Werner would be upset by some of their decisions. I actually know he would because he and I had some conversations every once in a while. And he's like, they're doing what? They're saying what? Like it's not even consistent. It's more consistent with the ideal. It's kind of like Jesus, right? What would Jesus do? And then people are out there kind of living what they think Jesus would do, but you don't have any idea what Jesus would do. Well, most of them kind of don't have any idea what Werner would do either. But there's a standard. So what the leaders need to be true to is the standard, not themselves. There's an inherent lie in there completely because every leader who tries to be themselves authentically, not every, but most, if it does not conform with the sort of acceptable society standards or images that would be a successful business, Landmark is very keen to be the secular, normal Reebok style business. They're very fashioned after that image. Their first CEO was a guy by the name of Dan Cox, who had come out of the C-suite of Coca-Cola. And that started that's when Landmark and the Scientology was starting to have problems. So they didn't want to be conflated with those weird new agey groups or anything. They were going to be the legitimate business, but their product happened to be transformation. So what's true in words and what's true in practice are two very different things.
Very different. I mean, I think, this other idea that, Scientology, like when they're recruiting people, they'll say you don't have to convert, you don't have to give up what you have, you don't have to say goodbye to any of your relationships. We just want to add to this, So one of the definitions of a cult to me is it becomes your whole life, it becomes your community, it becomes your practice, your belief system, all of it. And it demands that of you, that this is going to be everything in your life, and that you really are going to need to cut off other belief systems or time that you have for other people or other relationships. So I'm sure that's one of the definitions that I gave. And so what would be a landmark way of responding to that?
Well, the first thing would probably be, oh, that's not true. We encourage you to be authentic and be true to yourself and self-expression. And that, again, very similar to Scientology in that at the opening sets, it's like, oh, no, we're actually about that. But then when you get in and the more accountability, the higher you go in the ranks in the role, the more you need to conform again to their view. So, okay, you can be gay, but don't be too gay.
Well, I don't even know what that means, right? Like what? Okay.
Don't be any way that somebody in a room, because we want to reach the most people possible. It's kind of the 1990s homogeny view of the world. Like if there's like a standard and you want to be the standard so that you can reach the most people, right? So, okay, Landmark, unlike Scientology, happens to be fine with people being gay, but not too gay. Don't be too flamboyant. Don't be too weird. Don't be too, unless you produce a heck of a lot of results. If you produce a lot of business results, then we're a little bit more loose on our judgments. But the front answer is always going to basically be like, oh no, we're about self-expression. We're about authenticity. We're about integrity, being true to yourself. Like that's what people come here for. Do you feel limits and blocks in that in society, in your family, in your culture? Oh, great. Come do the Landmark Forum and we will help you remove those barriers. So you're going to remove barriers all the way till you get to the leadership program. And now you're standing in front of a room of 200 people or 150 people, and you have to, everybody has to see themselves in you. So now you can't be too gay or you can't have that kind of lifestyle, or you can't, anything. They had huge failings they took on in Highland Park in the Detroit area, for example. Brian Nord did an episode with a wonderful woman who was on staff in that area, and they did all these programs for inner city people of color and da-da-da-da-da. And then when the George Floyd killing happening and Black Lives Matter happened, they took no stand. In fact, the letter that came out from Harry Rosenberg, the CEO at the time, was like, we are not going to comment on this. And millions of graduates were pissed and upset because they're like, wait, this is the place where we get to be who we are. And if who I am is a person of color, or I'm a person who's gay, or I'm a person who's trans, I get to be that until you're representing the company, and then not so much. Unless it looks good for them. Now, I can hear one of the big things people will say, probably come up on the comments on this episode is, well, that you're describing, this is the other thing that pisses me off. Well, Anne, what you're describing happens everywhere. I just want to slap people when they say that. So I should keep just saying, oh, it happens everywhere, so I guess it's okay. Like, what's the rest? Why are you saying that? Oh, that happens in every organization. So that means it's okay to happen in this one that also happens to be about responsibility, integrity, authenticity? No, this organization's whole see, I believed what I said in the guest rooms. That's Landmark's problem with me.
Uh-huh.
And honest to God, Rachel, the day I published my book, I really did. There was a tiny little piece of my heart that really hoped they would hear my warnings and they would step up to the game. In fact, there's a challenge at the end of my book that there are such leaders in the industry that if they really started to educate themselves about what is culty, what are all these things that are coming out, and they adjusted themselves and they looked at themselves and they transformed themselves, they could be leaders in a safer and more ethical personal development world. I now know that is not going to happen.
That is really incredible.
And it's because of this exact thing you're saying, right? We're going to say this, but we're going to do that.
Yes, and it's sad. It's sad, especially if you believe in other parts of it. You believe. I mean, I could talk to you about this whole other idea, maybe another time, about that you can't make people feel things. That there is this whole thing that came out. I remember in the 70s, there were friends of my parents who were doing S training and who would be really confrontational and insulting suddenly. Then if someone got upset, they'd say, well, that's on you. Like, I can't make you feel that. That's on you to whatever, the language at the time was.
That's how you're interpreting it. That's how my husband said that to me the other day. I said something. He goes, well, that's just how you're I said, can you please just kind of try to take the tone out? Because he was being really impatient. And I do that to him too. And he's like, well, that's just how you're hearing me. And I thought, I was like, oh my gosh, there it is right there, right? Like, oh, that's, something I'm reacting or feeling something and that gets turned around on you completely. And there's so much straight up lying. That's what I realized after you went through that whole list and I had both sides of my head. Because a lot of it, their primary defense against being a cult is that there is no single leader, which is a straight out lie. Like it's just a lie. It's a total lie. Werner is the leader. What enables them to say that and still claim they have integrity, which they do, and they believe it. I promise you they believe it. We could take Mick Levitt, any of those leaders, he's the president right now. They believe it to their core because, one, they're totally indoctrinated. But here's what they're missing, that in order to be in the high elevations of that organization, to be in that hierarchy, you needed to become one thing, Werner. You needed to become the embodiment of Werner, because that's a big thing for cults, right? It has one leader. We don't have a Jim Jones. We don't have a, whatever, Muktananda. We don't have a one leader, so therefore we're not a cult. Well, they could get away with that in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s when Werner left, right? But not only did Werner stay completely involved, but the people who got to own Landmark were the people who Werner said had effectively and successfully so recreated themselves in his image. It's a complete just misidentification of the source of the work and the ideas. So it gets put onto a person. So now to be that, I have to be like that person. And that's what cult leader is actually about. It's not about the physical form or the identity. It's that way of thinking and being like, oh, okay, what would Jesus do? What would Werner do? But when they have people acting against their own best interest, it stops being benign. It stops being something that's sourceful and supportive of me and my life, and it starts to become exploitive. And exploitation, when followed, you will find abuse.
Right. Absolutely right. It is so important to be able to get this information out there so people also understand what's happened to them. Like if people are listening and they're involved in this organization and feel that they're getting something from it, but also something feels wrong or off and they don't have the words for it, this really helps. I think it's ultimately highly respectful of others to get this information out there. So you can say, maybe this will help you understand why you might be feeling X, Y, and Z. Because there really isn't a place for you to go within the organization to say, I am having these feelings, and to have them really listened to, unfortunately, and taken in and taken seriously or explained. But it would probably be, just as you're saying, it would be turned back on you. So I think for people to get it and, to give them this sense of why it is that things feel off or why it is that their life really isn't turning into the thing that it was promised to be if they were involved, and kind of to understand.
There's something I just want to so underline what you're saying that's so important. If you feel like something's off, something's off. And what you need to do, this is what I've learned, and this is what I didn't do for a long time and have been doing, you need to step out, step away from, whether it's your family, whatever system it is, you need to step out, step away. An academic told me this one time, the only way to truly see a system or understand a system is to fully surrender to it and then step out of it and question it. But then you want to question with people, respectable people who are educated, who have the knowledge, But also what I love, love, love that you bring to our group sessions all the time is you never make it wrong. You never make it's always like, wow, yeah, I could see like, yeah, you honor the good stuff as well. But then that enables me to pursue that gut feeling or that sense like, something doesn't seem right here. What is it that's not right? And sometimes you'll pursue that and you'll get, oh, I see. It's just this thing that I made up. That's another big thing in Landmark. Oh, you just made that up. It's not really happening. You just made that up. So, but that questioning. So to me is like, if you feel like something's not right, that's the time to take a break. That's the time to not register in the next seminar or not do the thing. It doesn't mean you never will. Maybe you will go back. I don't know. But step out and pursue that until it's really resolved in a way that feels good. That's how we use our feels system, as I have
like
learned.
it. I like it.
Well, I've learned a lot of it from you, so thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah, intuition, following your voice, even if you don't have the words to describe what it is that feels off, just as you're saying, it's enough that something just does not feel right, and that it's enough to give you pause. And yeah, you're right, to step away so that you have the perspective, so you can see, like taking any kind of good picture of a landscape, you have to step back farther, to really see it all.
See it, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you
Thank
for all that
you.
you do
Such a
in the
pleasure.
community. Yeah, really, really such a pleasure. And that you were willing to kind of jump into this space, which is very uncomfortable, right? A space where, you had, with every good and pure intention, had wanted this to be something that it turned out to not be to that degree. But now I feel like you're able to live out, those goals in a real way that's aligned with your conscience, that's aligned with you. And so hopefully that feels very healing for you.
It does. It does. It's uncomfortable and sad sometimes as I miss friends and I miss my old reputation or whatnot. But on the other hand, it feels good to be me.
So nice. And I'm glad. I'm glad you're you. I'm glad to have met you. I'm glad to know you. It's really been wonderful. So we will hopefully talk again soon. Be well.
Thank you.
One more thing before you go. Thank you to Anne for this episode. And again, make sure to catch part 1 of our conversation as well. Anne is someone who is very thoughtful and has done her research and cares deeply about making sure that people are not sent down a path that might mislead them rather than lead them. And I think that there is something really important about what she's doing, where she's not saying that self-help and being able to change yourself and improve on yourself is something that you should give up, but that you want to do it within a context that turns out to be trustworthy. I think it is important also to talk about some of the things that Anne brought up here. There are all these words that you hear all the time in this field, like the word integrity. So often, people within cultic groups, people within manipulative relationships are told that they have to show that they have integrity, that they are going to stick with something that they signed up for, that they are going to keep to the commitment that they signed on the dotted line to do, or they verbally promised that they would do. The problem is, though, that sometimes what you signed up to do turns out to be different than what you thought it was, and that you could engage in doing what you think is very helpful for yourself and for others, only to find out that it's not as helpful at times, and sometimes even is harmful. And so you're still held to this standard of showing integrity by sticking with it, by sticking with the fact that you made a promise to stick with it. But is that really showing integrity? Or is showing integrity following your conscience? which sometimes is different than the contract you signed. Sometimes following your conscience is different than the laws made up in the state or the country around you. Sometimes it means going your own way, and that's how you show integrity. It's also important that there is this social psychological piece that really does a number on people in these contexts. For example, when Anne was talking about how you are not supposed to engage in gossip and you're not supposed to be negative, and that doing so is going to be ruining it for others, it is quite a conundrum to put people in, because within groups like this, sometimes gossip is meant as gossip, and in all that entails, where someone is going to be torn down and someone is sharing information they shouldn't. But sometimes you really want to know if you're having a feeling that is on the mark or not. And so you want to share how you're feeling, or you want to share what someone said to you to see if another person can relay to you whether that feels healthy or not. Is that gossip, or is that a form of connection? Is that what friendships and relationships do for you, where you can check something out with another person? When a group doesn't want you to do that, though, when a group doesn't want you to connect with others and share your concerns and share your doubts, or relay a story about how you feel potentially or felt potentially mistreated by somebody else, they'll label it as gossip. But it's important for you to know that if that's not your intention, all you're trying to do is get clarification, which shouldn't be kept from you. You should be able to get some clarity about what you're going through and what you're experiencing. There's also this prohibition about being negative, which I think is really wrong. And it's true in almost every large group awareness training, similar to this group. You are not supposed to be negative. But let's look at the word negative. If somebody doesn't want you to be noticing what's wrong with something, they'll label you as negative. They'll call you something like a troublemaker. But are you being negative, or are you stating a fact? If you're saying that you are not able to have free time to celebrate your own birthday, or that you're exhausted and because you've become an instructor in this group, you're just not getting enough sleep, are you being negative, or are you stating facts? Well, if you're not supposed to be negative and that's called negative, then you keep yourself from sharing these things. And then you don't get support, you don't get feedback, you don't find out that actually you're not the only one who's feeling that way. And then this other kind of label put on you, which is that you're going to be ruining it for others. If you talk in a negative way, quote unquote, if you gossip, quote unquote, if you decide to leave, if you criticize the group in any way, you're going to be ruining it for others. That's the social psychological piece. That you feel responsible for the people around you. You feel that you owe them your support of this group. You almost owe them your silence, right? Not speaking up, not being critical. But you actually don't owe them anything in that moment. You owe something to yourself, which is to look at things as honestly as you can, and to know that you have, according to the Constitution of the United States, if it's here in the United States, you have the freedom of expression. You should be able to say, I don't like this. You should be able to say, someone did something to me that was not okay. You should be able to say, I feel like I'm being run ragged, or this isn't offering me the answers that I signed up for, or I don't know if the way I've been instructed to teach people these sorts of things is actually helping them or hurting them, and I need to know before I continue. In a context where you're told that if you say these things, you're ruining it for others, ultimately, what are you ruining? You're ruining the chance for them to continue in something that you're not quite sure is healthy anymore. And so maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe it's not a bad thing to have your questioning cause other people to question. Maybe it helps them take a moment, take a step back, and look at things themselves and have the bravery to do so. Thank you so much to Anne for all the work that she has done and continues to do. It's been a pleasure getting to know her. I'll talk to you all next week. Thank you very much for listening. Please support Indoctrination on Patreon at patreon.com/indoctrination. Be sure to give us a follow on our social media. Find us on Facebook and Instagram using @Indoctrination Podcast. And for Twitter, find us at @_indoctrination. We love hearing from you too. So send us an email at indoctrinationshow@gmail.com. And for more updates on the show, visit our website at www.podpage.com/indoctrination.